She was more than just a pretty face on the cover of Vogue. Stella Tennant redefined what it meant to be a supermodel in the 1990s, tall, androgynous, elegant, and unapologetically different. Born into British aristocracy, she had every reason to live a quiet, privileged life. But instead, she stepped into the spotlight and made waves in the fashion world with her bold look and quiet strength. Designers adored her. Magazines couldn't get enough. To many, she seemed invincible, untouchable even. She had it all: the beauty of fame and a life most people could only dream of. But behind the camera flashes and runway lights, Stella was fighting a battle no one could see. While the world praised her style, few knew the silent weight she carried. She wasn't one for drama or headlines, and maybe that's why her story was so easy to miss. There were no scandals, no big outbursts, just a quiet unraveling hidden beneath years of grace and poise. As time passed, the fashion world evolved, and Stella stepped back, some say gracefully, others say painfully. She shifted her focus to her family, her art, and the countryside life she loved. But even there, in the calm of rural Scotland, something deeper was still pulling at her. Something even her closest friends and family may not have fully understood. So what really happened to Stella Tennant? How does a woman who seemed to have everything fall into silence so suddenly? And why did her final chapter shock so many who thought they knew her? In this story, we uncover the layers behind the headlines, the woman behind the runway, and the quiet storm that led to her tragic end. But to understand her fall, we first need to understand who Stella Tennant really was. Stella Tennant was never chasing the spotlight, it simply found her. Born into a family tied to nobility and history, she could have chosen a life away from the chaos of fame. But something about the world of fashion called to her, and when she answered, it felt like the industry had been waiting for someone exactly like her. With short dark hair, sharp features, and a striking presence that defied traditional beauty standards, Stella didn't just walk into fashion, she changed it. Designers like Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel saw in her a kind of elegance that was raw and modern. She wasn't trying to be glamorous. She just was. And that quiet confidence made her unforgettable. In the 1990s, she became a symbol of the new wave of supermodels, cool, intelligent, and effortlessly edgy. She walked for major designers, appeared on dozens of magazine covers, and inspired photographers with her unique look. But even at the height of her success, Stella kept her distance from the fame machine. She rarely gave interviews. She wasn't drawn to celebrity parties or media attention. To her, modeling was work, not identity. And that's what made her so fascinating. She moved through a world obsessed with image, yet seemed almost untouched by it. But what the public didn't always see was the emotional weight that can come with living in a world that never really lets you slow down. After having 4 children and moving to the countryside, Stella took more time away from fashion. She worked on her sculptures, her garden, and built a life that was quieter, more rooted. Yet even as she stepped back, the pressure and expectations didn't always go away. For someone so private, living with invisible struggles could feel isolating. Friends noticed changes, but Stella was strong, or at least she always appeared that way. Still, questions linger. Was it the pressure of fame? Was it the quiet loneliness that followed after stepping away from the spotlight? Or was there something deeper she never shared? The world only saw the surface, perfect photos, graceful runway walks, headlines calling her iconic. But what was happening underneath all that? As her life began to change in ways no one could fully explain, those closest to her started noticing the silence growing louder. And just when it seemed like she had finally found peace, everything suddenly fell apart. In the last few years of her life, Stella Tennant seemed to be living quietly and purposefully. She had traded high-fashion runways for muddy boots and garden gloves, spending her time in the Scottish countryside, far from flashing cameras. But behind the scenes, something wasn't quite right. Friends described a shift, a subtle fading of the light in her eyes, a distance even in close conversation. She was still kind, still thoughtful, but there was a heaviness in her that hadn't been there before. Those who knew her well say Stella had always been intensely private. She carried herself with quiet strength, never wanting to burden others. Even in the height of her career, she was known to shy away from the chaos of fame. She would finish a fashion shoot, fly back home, and be in the kitchen cooking for her kids the next day. But over time, that balancing act grew harder. The pressure of maintaining two lives, one glamorous, one grounded, started to wear on her. And then came the turning point. Her marriage of over 2 decades ended quietly, with little public attention. To most people, it was just a simple, respectful separation. But close friends knew that the breakup left a deeper wound. Stella had built her world around family and stability. That loss, no matter how calmly handled on the surface, shook the foundation she had spent years protecting. At the same time, the fashion world, once her second home, felt more distant than ever. It had moved on, faster and louder, filled with influencers and constant content. The world that once embraced Stella's quiet elegance now seemed too fast, too artificial. Her name still carried weight, but she wasn't part of the new conversation anymore. That isolation, both personal and professional, grew silently. And yet, she never reached out in desperation. She never made a scene. She continued raising her children, working on art, trying to move forward. But those around her noticed she was retreating, slowly, quietly. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were politely declined. It was as if she was slipping away, piece by piece, right in front of them. No one saw a dramatic spiral. There was no loud fall from grace. Just a series of quiet moments that, when added up, told a story no one wanted to believe. And by the time anyone realized how serious it was already too late. Winter had just begun settling over the hills of Scotland when those closest to Stella started to truly worry. There was something about the stillness in her voice, the pauses in her words, the way she looked just past you when you spoke. She was present, but not fully there. Her friends and family, though deeply respectful of her space, started checking in more often. But Stella, being who she was, always reassured them with a soft smile and a calm tone. "I'm fine," she'd say. "Just tired." On social media, there were no warning signs. Her presence was minimal, as always. She was never one to overshare or chase attention. But to those watching closely, even the quiet had a weight. Some days she seemed okay, busy with her art, walking the dogs, chatting with her children. But other days, she would drift off into herself, unreachable, like she was trying to figure something out that she couldn't quite say aloud. Behind closed doors, Stella was wrestling with questions no one could easily answer. Who was she without fashion? Without the image the world once celebrated? And now, after the breakdown of her marriage, what did her future even look like? For someone who had always kept a tight grip on her world, the uncertainty began to press harder. The walls she had so carefully built, of privacy, of strength, started to close in. People in the village would mention seeing her walking alone more often, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes lost in thought. Her studio, once filled with the energy of new ideas and sculptures, grew quieter. The radio played softly in the background, but Stella seemed more focused on something inward. She wasn't seeking attention. She was seeking peace, or maybe answers. Her children were her constant anchor, and she tried her best to keep their world steady. But even they began sensing a shift. Something had changed in their mother's gaze. She held them close, perhaps tighter than before, like part of her already knew how fragile everything had become. The people who loved her most were doing their best, but they didn't know just how close she was to the edge. And Stella, always strong, always graceful, kept walking that quiet path alone, never revealing just how far she had drifted. The question that haunted everyone would come too late: how did it get this far without anyone truly knowing? Just when things seemed like they couldn't grow heavier, a second wave hit, a twist that few saw coming, even those closest to Stella. It began with a phone call from an old friend in the industry, someone who had worked with her during her earliest modeling days. They were planning a reunion campaign, an homage to the greats of the 90s, and they wanted Stella at the center of it. A high-profile brand was ready to relaunch its image with the faces that had defined a generation, and Stella Tennant was at the top of their list. For most, this would have been exciting news. A comeback. A reminder that she was still iconic, still wanted, still deeply respected in the fashion world. But for Stella, it triggered something else entirely. Her name had been out of the headlines for years. She had carefully removed herself from the fast-paced industry that once consumed so much of her energy. Now, they wanted her back, not for who she was now, but for who she used to be. And in that request, something cracked. She didn't say no immediately. She took time to think about it, retreating even deeper into herself. For weeks, she went back and forth. Was this a chance to reclaim her story? Or was it another attempt by the world to define her by old standards? Those around her noticed the shift. She became more withdrawn, less open, harder to reach. She stopped returning messages again, avoided visits, and buried herself in routine tasks with a mechanical kind of energy. Privately, she opened up to a close friend, admitting that she didn't know if she could step back into that world. Not physically, she still looked effortlessly striking, but emotionally. It wasn't just about walking a runway or posing for a photo. It was about facing everything she had quietly left behind. The long hours. The pressure. The unspoken expectations. The parts of herself she had tucked away to survive that world. And then, just days before she was meant to give her answer, Stella discovered something unexpected: a collection of old letters and journals she had written in her 20s and 30s. They were tucked in a box she hadn't opened in years. Reading them, she was transported back to the beginning of her career. The excitement. The confusion. The quiet anxiety. The letters weren't dramatic, but they revealed a side of Stella she had long stopped acknowledging. A version of herself that had once been full of hope, but also full of doubt. What disturbed her most wasn't what the letters said, it was how familiar they still felt. After all this time, the same inner conflicts still echoed in her heart. Had she ever truly escaped them? Had anything really changed beneath the surface? This quiet discovery deepened the storm already brewing inside her. She wasn't just questioning a return to fashion. She was questioning her entire journey, her identity, her choices, and whether the life she had carefully built away from the spotlight had ever really healed her. And now, with the world knocking again, she stood at a crossroads with no clear direction, while the pressure built silently around her. In the days that followed, Stella disappeared from contact completely. Emails went unread, calls went unanswered, and even her closest friends began to grow uneasy. The brand waiting on her reply never received one. But what no one knew was that Stella had made a quiet decision. Early one morning, before the rest of the village stirred, she left the house and drove out to one of her favorite walking spots, an old stone path that curved along the edge of a quiet glen. It was a place she'd always gone to think, to breathe, to escape the noise. There, with the wind brushing through the trees and the stillness around her, she allowed herself to finally let go. She wept, not just for what was lost but for what had never fully healed. The years of pressure, the weight of being admired but not always understood, the feeling of slipping between worlds, none of it had ever truly left her. But in that moment, she didn't run from it anymore. She sat with it. Faced it. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift. When she returned home that night, she wrote a letter, not to the fashion brand, but to her children. In it, she spoke honestly and openly about her struggles, her fears, and her hopes for their future. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she wanted them to know that she was trying, truly trying, to find peace within herself. That letter, later shared privately among her family, became a final gift, raw, real, and full of love. The public would learn of her passing days later, and the headlines were heartbreaking. Stella Tennant had died suddenly at the age of 50. Tributes poured in from across the world, designers, models, fans, all sharing stories of her grace, her authenticity, her quiet power. But behind the scenes, her family held on to that letter. It didn't explain everything, but it gave them something the world never saw, a glimpse of the woman behind the image. And just as the story seemed to close, one final surprise came. Months later, a gallery announced an upcoming show featuring sculptures and sketches by Stella herself, art she had quietly been working on for years. She had never told many people. It was as if she had left behind a second voice, one that didn't need the runway, but still had something to say. Stella Tennant's story didn't end in the spotlight, but maybe that's how she always wanted it. The world knew her as a supermodel, an icon of 90s fashion, a muse to designers like Karl Lagerfeld and Alexander McQueen. But those closest to her knew her as something much deeper, a mother, an artist, a woman quietly navigating the weight of being seen but not always understood. Her passing left many stunned, not just because of the loss itself, but because it forced people to realize how easily we can overlook the silent battles others carry. Her final letter to her children, filled with honesty and tenderness, gave her family and friends a small sense of peace. It didn't erase the pain, but it reminded them that Stella loved deeply, even when she struggled silently. And when her private artwork was later revealed to the public, it opened another door into her soul, delicate sculptures, abstract forms, quiet pieces that spoke without words. It became clear that while she had stepped away from fashion, she had never stopped creating, never stopped expressing the things she couldn't always say aloud. The fashion industry, shaken by the loss, began to reflect on the kind of pressure it places on those it lifts up. Many called for deeper conversations around mental health, especially for women in the public eye. Stella's legacy became more than just her image, it became a moment to pause and truly look beyond the surface. For those who admired her from afar, her story is a reminder that elegance doesn't always come with ease, and strength doesn't always mean smiling through the pain. Stella Tennant had it all, or so it seemed, but her journey showed us that even the brightest stars can carry shadows. And perhaps the most human thing we can learn from her is this: sometimes, the people who seem the strongest are the ones quietly holding on. As we remember Stella, not just the supermodel, but the woman behind the stillness, we carry forward her quiet grace and her lasting impact. In her silence, there was depth. In her distance, there was meaning. And in her art, her family, and her memory, she remains beautifully present.